Jeff, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction. And I think one of the things that can be counted on with Jeff is to try to situate not only individuals, but I think lots of things in architecture in a spectrum that helps all of us try to negotiate what's sometimes a complicated territory. And I think Jeff is very good at enabling us to find roadmaps through it that are remarkably productive for all of us. So I very much appreciate that on a personal level as well as on a more general level as somebody practicing and teaching. As Jeff indicated, I'm going to talk about a series of projects. I am going to talk through some notions having to do with the plan at the beginning, and then I'm going to show 4 projects. And I'm going to use one of the projects. The term track jumping comes from one of the projects, the first project that I'll show, which, as you will see, has a lot to do with plan organization and plan sort of spatial thinking. But I will use that as a kind of barometer or a kind of catalyst in the same way that we have used that project for the development of several other projects along the way. So you're going to see very different projects in terms of chronology, in terms of scale. You'll see actually some fairly large work, and also I'll end on a very small project, the Golden House, that Jeff referred to. So I'm going to start by trying to give you 2 preconditions, very, very briefly, for the way that we've been approaching work over the last few years. The first one has to do with a kind of general notion of something that we refer to as a compound figure. And what I mean by that can maybe be described here. This is a Go game. I don't know if you're familiar with Go. It's a Japanese board game. And this is a piece, an artwork done by Paul Talman in 1965. And these two for me are quite interesting as just a simple way of trying to make my point. And what I'm going to try to get at here is the idea that the black and white in this diagram and the black and white in this diagram are working in really, really different ways. The game of Go has one objective, really, to try to enclose space. White encloses black, or black encloses white. But white is absolute and black is absolute. Whereas what happens here is something that I'm going to kind of very rapidly do a few overlays for you to try to make the case that what's happening in this is that the fact that each unit is capable of being both black and white, or black or white, means that it's possible to construct organizations or figures of organization inside this system that are at times overlapping, at times quite distinct, at times remade in different ways. In other words, those figures oscillate in and out of focus in various ways, in ways that are impossible to have happen in a game of Go, the binary maintaining the black and white. So this is what I mean by that. If you start to extract figures from this, or logics, or say sympathies among different kinds of figures inside this, you can make a series of overlays like this. There are many, many ways to do this. You can add additional overlays. You can do that to your heart's content. But basically, this system is quite dynamic and reverberates with a whole series of these kinds of overlays of figures. Now, I'm using the figure pretty broadly here. As you'll see in the next one of my preconditions, we're very interested in the idea that the figure, in addition to the plan, and I think this is where Jeff's introduction began to touch on certain things that are very significant relative to the figure. The figure, I think, got a very bad name in the 80s because of its association with postmodernism. So one of the first things that we were aware of was how we, on the one hand, wanted to engage that discourse because it's a very old, very deep, very significant discourse in architecture. And on the other hand, how do we avoid the tar pit of the 80s, which was basically invoking figural sort of language in the plan in particular, from the Renaissance, from the 18th century, and producing architectures that were sort of reminiscent. So essentially what we are interested in is the notion of a figure which is legible but non-representational. And that's all wrapped up in the way that I'm using that term here tonight. The second precondition that I want to talk about, also related to the plan, has to do with our interest in program and form and the relationship between the two of them. And also then the way, in fact, the two, in a sense, collapse. That's what I mean by plan and tautology. That the program and form, or the deployment or expectation that one might have for program and form are somewhat like a cat chasing its tail. They're inseparable from one another. It doesn't really matter where you start, doesn't really matter where you end. In fact, that act of chasing one's tail is far more interesting in the relationship between program and form than saying it's the program or it's the form, which are exclusive categories that we have tended to fall into, I think, fairly dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years, if not longer. So this starts with some really simple distillations. There's a Vitruvian underlay here, commodity, firmness, delight. And I'm simply saying that commodity can be updated to program, there are differences. Firmness is simply technology, delight is form. And there's a simple equation in each of these diagrams in terms of where each of those circumstances lies. I'm not trying to make an argument here that's watertight. I'm trying to give you a view into certain procedures that we're using so that we can begin to manipulate things with some confidence that we know where we're playing a game. So in this case, program is associated with floor, an infinitely thin layer of management. You could call it just management, just lines on a floor that control things that have to do with the use of space, movement of space, but infinitely thin. Technology resides in the ceiling. It's up there. It's the thick stuff that is structure, mechanical systems, lights, etc. And form resides in the kind of vertical deployment of surfaces that we tend to apprehend perpendicular to our cone of vision, in a sense. A very simple kind of distillation of what architecture is made of. And on particularly, I think as Jeff pointed out, I have particularly bombastic days. On those days, I say that all of architecture is made out of these and nothing else matters, or nothing else exists if I'm even more bombastic. So in our game, we're interested in this, we're interested in this, we're interested in this, but only in a mute sense. In other words, I have no interest in the display of hardware, but I understand the fact that we can't do anything without hardware, without structural systems, without mechanical systems. But it's these two that we're interested in bringing to the fore in terms of a set of working techniques. And the middle one stays latent, let's say. And then, obviously, the sets of relations that can be produced out of the entanglements of all three of those, or in particular the two that I'm highlighting, are fairly broad, fairly infinite if you start to speculate about what that might mean in each case. All right, so first project. This is a competition entry for a project that we received the brief for it, and for months, actually, I sat looking at it and I thought I really didn't want to get involved in this project because it didn't seem like it was appropriate for us. It was a sound barrier alongside a runway extension in the Netherlands at Schiphol Airport outside Amsterdam. And I kept looking at this brief thinking, this makes no sense, we're not sound people. But off in the corner of the brief, there was mention of a 2 million square foot program, an R&D facility, a research and development park of sorts. But I kept thinking this thing is completely dominated by the sound component, and in fact, it was dominated by the sound component, but I kept being baited in a sense by the notion that there was this other program sitting adjacent to it. So we decided to do it, and we began to work with systems of organization. As you can see, you'll see quite a bit of this in plan. Systems of organization that were meant to produce affiliations not within, say, a building block or only concerned with program, but affiliations that would link program to landscape, to circulation, to parking, to a whole series of subsystems inside the building, all predicated on a geometric organizing system that moved back and forth as a kind of deep sound baffle, a lot like these holes in the wall in here, but a kind of massive sound baffle that would capture sound from airplanes taking off along the runway parallel to this. So essentially, we were trying to organize this 2 million square feet, that much building, with geometry, and this was their sort of starting point. And actually kind of interesting to us to start thinking about geometry here as well, began to think a little bit not only of the plan, but the role of geometry in architecture, and the fact that geometry has acquired, I think over the last, say, 15 to 20 years, I'd say since the early 90s, a very different status. That term has acquired a very different status. It used to be a term that meant that was all inclusive, that architecture could be described, say, in terms of the geometry of facades, the geometry of plans, the geometry of functions, the geometry of organizations of technology everywhere. And I think in the last 15 to 20 years, geometry has become much more singularly aligned with certain kinds of surface projects, certain kinds of computational projects that have been extremely interesting, but much more singular in the way that that term is understood. So we began to look also at the idea that geometry could acquire that metastatus again. And in that sense, the first thing that we had to do was, in a sense, suppress it. In other words, for it to be able to move across all of those domains, it had to be itself valueless, empty, entirely hollow. And we began to look at that notion as a way of then using that fleetness, that hollowness or lightness, to move across from one system to another, from program to landscape to circulation to technology. So this is the resulting plan. I'm going to kind of parse this for you through a series of diagrams to show you what's going on in here. But the green roofs are program areas. The pale green are landscape. All those little stipply dots are a series of about 13,000 sound baffles, some flower gardens. You can see circulation, bike paths, roads, and pedestrian walkways. So essentially, what we did was we overlaid a series of systems through this kind of meta-geometry so that we would begin to be able to affiliate, for example, a bike path with a roadway, a pedestrian walkway with program, and have it jump, in a sense, and create new affiliations with, say, a terrace outside, an outdoor space here, a bike path taking over a landscape and then ending before another landscape. That's what we're referring to, that's what I'm referring to when I talk about track jumping, is the notion that geometry will run from one domain to another, sometimes stitching pieces together, and sometimes obviating relationships among parts. So I'll run quickly through now the series of layers. Those are bike paths. Those are pedestrian paths. Sometimes more continuous, sometimes less continuous. The point of continuity was neither to avoid it or rely on it solely. Landscape, a big inclined surface that's part of, this is the runway, by the way. So the big sound problem was airplanes starting here, running down this way, and this is their peak moment of noise on takeoff when they're accelerating. So this is a big inclined surface that points down, covered with those 13,000 acoustic shields. That's the parking garage with very few moments where the logic of the rest of the say, figure, the logic of that geometry bites in and allows for certain relationships between the buildings and the parking garage. The program areas. So this is essentially that 2 million square feet, not entirely, but most of it. Roads, outdoor terraces, and then the composite. So you can also begin to see a little bit more about how we're trying to weave together in the section, but in fact in a very compressed way. And I think this is part of what has led to the characterization of our work as plan intensive, and I think rightly so. But in fact what we're doing is, in a sense, we're elevating the 3D in a kind of 2.5D manner. It remains very compressed into a kind of a flat state. And in part that also has to do with our own interest in program as a kind of baseline. Jeff referred to the fact that both Sarah and I had worked at OMA, and I think we got our dose of program indoctrination in the office there and elsewhere. But in one way, that tethers us to the notion of flat surface, in as much as flat surface is extremely useful when it comes to program, as opposed to inclined surface, which tends to edit out many programmatic possibilities. Series of section diagrams just showing some of what happens in there. The parking garage always cutting through here. You can see that as a repeat. The circulation spiraling up and down, program in different kinds of massing configurations. Here you can also get a little bit of a sense of that track jumping occurring not only in a kind of 2D sense, but in this kind of 2.5D sense where things move up and down the slopes, into holes, up and across surfaces, down onto terraces. And here you get some sense of the density of those shields arrayed along that slope. In fact, from this point of view, you can see that they're almost a continuous wall accumulating in depth as they go back up the incline. The next two projects are actually kind of a pair of projects in the way that we worked on them. These are more recent. The previous project was done several years ago. These were done last summer. And in many ways, they were a response to the first project that I showed. And by response, the main issue for us in working on them had to do with the fact that in the first project, the regulating system, the geometric system, say the track jumping system, was really primarily about controlling regions of space, bars of program, landscapes, etc., with occasionally things that looked linear, but in fact even those were sort of controlling as a dimensionally wide condition. What we wanted to do was actually begin to look at the use of again, this hollow geometry as a perimeter condition, as a kind of silhouette around a building. And we did it in two ways in these projects. In plan, this is the Kaohsiung concert hall competition that was run last summer, and this is the port terminal competition that was located about 1,000 feet from this one. So these are essentially neighbors of one another. But the idea was to use that notion of geometry in plan as a kind of perimeter construct, and in section as a perimeter construct here, as a way of looking at a kind of overall formal output and what that would do in terms of organizing or not organizing, in fact, more interestingly in certain ways, things happening on the inside and things happening on the outside of that perimeter state. First project, Circular Logic, the pop music facility. In fact, the program for this included additional components, not only pop music concert halls. It included, though, a major pop concert hall, a series of 8 additional concert halls, an incubator for pop music in Taiwan and Kaohsiung, a museum for pop music, and also a maritime museum and an outdoor amphitheater for about 12,000 people. It's a really vast program, totaling up to around 400,000 square feet, all embedded in this site around a waterfront in downtown Kaohsiung. So the abbreviated, the Cliff Notes version of that is, we wanted to use the circle. And again, returning to this idea that it as a conceit, I mean, anybody who's looked at the circle or geometry in general, forget the circle for a moment, but geometry in general, particularly the circle, will realize the kind of cross that the circle has come to bear historically in architecture. You can look at almost any moment and see it as a kind of savior or a devil in different contexts. But we wanted to approach it again as a completely hollow circumstance in which the first thing we did was to imagine that the circle is incapable of fully stopping, for example, anything that might be happening on a site. It's also capable of acting as a kind of guillotine, like a cookie cutter, extracting that material on the site, making for a completely different domain inside. Finally, then we added a single component during the course of the competition, which was a way of trying to create a relationship between what was happening here as a space independent of what was happening out here that could selectively begin to negotiate very tight relationships episodically around the perimeter of this circle, not only, say, between the inside and the outside across this edge, but also potentially among clusters of circles because of the nature of the program. So a very simple set of, say, didactic operations to start with. So the site for this competition is all the colored stuff here. This we appropriated just to kind of jump across with a landscape piece. But in fact, a huge site. One of the things to keep in mind, look at the scale of these buildings. This is the primary concert hall, a single program piece. But compare that to what's happening out in here, for example, and you can start to get a sense of how big some of these pieces are programmatically. They're enormous. And at the same time, the site was similarly enormous. And one of the things that we were very rapidly struck by was the fact that it really was a site that was too big for us to really fill with the amount of program that we had. And at the same time, the program was too big to sort of not allow it to fully claim the site. So we began to work not only with individual circles, but with the notion of these clusters of circles to produce a kind of rattling urbanism in which, in fact, it's quite hard to know whether these disks float up almost beaching themselves coming out of the water on the shore of the city, or whether the city is sliding off into the water. Deliberately a kind of double reading that we wanted to give the collective ensemble of these spaces. Just to give you an idea what's going on, that's the outdoor amphitheater for 12,000. That's the incubator. There's a bridge that goes across. You'll see in a moment a view that shows it elevated. This is an administrative building with parking down below, primary concert hall. This is a stack of 8 smaller concert halls, a vertical array of them. This is a maritime exhibit facility and a music exhibit facility here, and some commercial spaces along there. The gray discs, they're there, and one underneath there are parking structures. So what we became interested in was to go back to those diagrams, various ways in which we could approach this limit condition, the kind of hollow limit condition that I was describing earlier, in various ways. So these plans are not in a relative scale. That's not the aim of this slide. What the aim is to show you various ways in which the circle excises space from that larger field of urban relations, and at times clips through with, say, a service road, with a public plaza that leaps the boundary of that circle, clipping the circle into the public space beyond, with a kind of public trajectory that comes up at this point, goes through a kind of checkpoint valve, accessing a terrace and going around eventually a top space here. This becomes part of actually a network of exterior spaces. And in each one, this is the sequence of plans in the large concert hall. This is the sequence of plans in the stacked concert halls. This is the incubator. In the incubator, as you can imagine, these are sound recording studios in which black box is essentially what you're after. And so the circulation moved to the perimeter and became a kind of offset or a kind of circumference, almost protecting the rest of the building from external influence. And also we began to toy with what would happen with conjoined circles, or sort of Siamese twins or triplets of circles down at the bottom in this Maritime Culture Exhibit Center. In various ways, in other words, clipping into the site, taking bites out, allowing a bridge. You can see here the ghost of an overhead bridge coming in, going down a spiral staircase here, eventually going out through another slot in the bottom of this. So various ways in which the geometry was used to key in relationships, and at the same time allow these individual buildings almost to spin freely on the site in their own right. Here you get a little bit of the sense of the city sliding out into the water, or the water sort of beaching these things up on the shore of the city. There's the outdoor theater. And a kind of old school drawing, meaning axonometric, of the overall circulation and public space diagram. You can start to see how the circulation, the public spaces are clipped into or onto different parts of the circles in various ways. This is a primary space going up a long ramp that feeds activities that are special activities for the concert facility here, the primary concert facility, sort of a series of check valves that allow that to be joined or not joined, continuing around, going across the water here. Here's that elevated, what we call the hover lounge, moving across the waterway here so that boats could continue to pass underneath it. It'll be a little more explicit when I show you the next view. There are a series of ferries, that's what these dotted lines are, a series of ferries that move around on this waterway. We should have colored the water blue here so you'd see it more clearly, but basically all of this area is water. The green is all public space and the blue is all circulation. There's more or less that same view. That same public space here elevated above the water. And one of the other things that we became aware of as we started to push these circles together was the fact that the circles themselves began to lose force or the necessity to declare themselves as cylinders at various points, especially from the ground plane. But what became more interesting was the jostlings among them. So the kind of space that was created around them in which sometimes access to buildings was very precise and sometimes kind of casual, sometimes sort of frontal in a sense, sometimes tangential to volumes. But rather than say this circle is important, what was more important was this part of this circle meeting this part of this circle meeting this part of this circle became a much more compelling opportunity in terms of what kinds of space or what kinds of urbanism we were producing on the exterior. They're really happy here. Just really quickly, this is the Performance Center again, just to give you a kind of rundown. Certain programmatic diagrams that we were moving through. One of the things that we were taken with was the idea. We basically bootlegged the logic of the auditorium building in Chicago, which had a very interesting quality in that it could be there could be a raised stage placed into it, and it could become a beer hall. So we were very interested in the idea that this mammoth concert hall could be converted from a concert setup to a kind of beer hall setup by elevating a platform and taking over the entire disk of the concert area for events that were not necessarily centered on performance, but rather on the gathering of people. So project 2 in this pair of projects from last summer is the Port Terminal project, another competition, as I said, about 1,000 feet, located about 1,000 feet away from the other one, just around the corner on the shoreline. And what we wanted to do here was take that notion of perimeter or profile and turn it on edge and use it as a kind of section device. And we began looking at that actually as a result of a kind of analysis of the program in which really there were two kinds of space in the program. One is a giant set of halls for processing people going through, who are coming off ships, going through customs, basically the kinds of fairly lateral halls. Think of the FOA Yokohama project, for example, certain dimensional in terms of Z dimension to X and Y dimension, a kind of flat bar that produces this kind of space in terms of the organizations of people and movement in it. And an office slab on the other side, which is a bar slab, stacked set of floor plates that houses office space that maximizes access to daylight, for example. What we were interested in was the fact that both of these existed, and in essence, what would happen if we made our profile out of the combination of that kind of program space and that kind of program space and end up there. And what ensued from there was a realization that as you move along you'll see in a moment, a very simple extrusion of that cruciform down the length of a long building, a huge number of outputs are available for how one would begin to take over zones, this to this to this, this to this to this, etc. You have the quadrants of the cruciform itself, or the cruciform as a totality. In addition, you have the quadrants of space down below, which are quite useful when, for example, one quadrant faces water, one quadrant faces a public space, the land side, and a parking structure, public terraces that face back toward the city or overlook the water, program down below a bar. In other words, in the literal shadow and organizational shadow of the processing for the port terminal, passenger processing for the port terminal, so below and above. In other words, those arms immediately produce an enormous amount of variation in terms of circulation, program, and relationship to the city and the water's edge. More old school. An axonometric showing all the public spaces here, and the pink here showing the system of escalators that moves up and down through it, public, internal, so really for the building function, public meaning going from the public space on this side up through the building, climbing up almost like a kind of Mayan ascent through the building and ending up on the Belvedere back behind this building that overlooks the water, so city side, water side. More explicit version of that section. An elevated landscape covering a parking garage here. You can also begin to see the role that this cruciform played in producing a drop-off area, a covered drop-off area, another processing area for the movement of goods out onto the ships as well as people, dropping out of the processing for people up at this level, and then two landscapes at the top and an office bar here, another office bar here. Cutaway section. So this now the horizontal cantilevered zone, baggage handling happening in there, office structures here, or office spaces. A kind of elevation and a section of sort of where's Waldo drawing. You can see here, for example, the longitudinal escalators, and you get a glimpse at least of the transverse escalators here and here, for example. And a series of section cuts showing different variations and what happens across that cruciform at various points. Quite hard to read here. I'm not going to linger on this. A view along the length of the bar showing the longitudinal escalators. Water on the right, city on the left. So this is the drop-off area here and parking structure. Underneath the big flat passenger processing areas. And here's a very simple diagram of what's going on there. Essentially, the public space and parking is all feeding into this area. The ships are all feeding into this area in a kind of servicing manner. All the passengers are being handled in here, and primarily there's a feed up and then a kind of rattling around inside organizationally, and a series of office spaces which are gaining views and accessing these terraces as a kind of usable recreational public space on the top. The structural diagram, as simple as we could make it, obviously kind of mammoth structural system. Keep in mind that these trusses, this is a 3-story tall truss, this is a 2-story tall truss. But one of the things you can see here is that some of those trusses are located starting from the bottom of the cantilevered bar up. Say this one is dropped down. Some of them are full height, some of them are at the top. In other words, those trusses, the cantilevers are working in such a way that they are able to accommodate various kinds of programmatic span requirements inside the length of that processing hall, passenger processing hall at that level. There's another interesting series of outcomes from expanding these trusses, not only for structural reasons, but the taller this gets, the more you get a kind of attenuation in this height, which means that you can in fact pass through them more and more easily as you change the dimensions of those trusses in the upward direction. Here's the drop-off zone. We had a guy working for us who was, I don't know how else to describe it. I always describe this as the kind of Jesus slider in Photoshop, where there's a button you can slide and somebody descends from the heavens and puts light like this into your drawings. A series of plans. What's important in these plans is it's not terribly clear in these three in particular, but the appearance of the bar here, a bar here, a bar here, and then the bar here with the passenger loading coming down, and then that bar widening at those cantilevered points for these three interior floors. That's the roof of that wide area, and then it returns back to a bar structure again at the top. A series of organizational diagrams just showing what happens with access, with the immigration control, and the division of spaces between passengers and an administrative space for for shipping services also located in the building. I'm going to kind of zoom of the elevation. Okay, the last project that I want to show is the Golden House. As Jeff referred to it, it was completed about 10 months ago, and is a project that we spent a great deal of time on. It was very important to us for a number of reasons. It's altogether different in terms of scale. It's about a 5,000 square foot house. The clients for this house came to us and asked us to look at a piece of property they hadn't yet purchased. And they asked us to try to help them decide whether or not they ought to purchase it. And so we said, fine, that sounds good. We went over and looked at it. We said, give us 2 weeks. And we walked away and went back to them 2 weeks later and said, yes, we think you should buy it, but we also think you should tear down 2/3 of it, which was a perfect way to get business. And so it wasn't as cynical as that, actually. The house is extremely interesting. The origins of the house were actually very, very interesting. It was originally built in the 18th century, mid-18th century. Then it was added on in the early 19th century, added on to again in the late 19th century, and added on again in the middle of the 20th century. And it was the 20th century part that was worst. And we said, that's the part you ought to take off, and they agreed to do that. So part of the working process, or part of the mandate in this house, had to do with how we would negotiate a relationship to this very, very old building. There was no historic template. We could do anything we wanted. But the owners and we agreed that the existing spaces were actually quite interesting. And furthermore, they introduced certain problems, almost, I mean, Scott must have lectured here recently. Scott Cohen lectured here?
When you say recently, for me it was recently, but most of them don't think it's getting.
Well, I'll use Scott as a kind of example. Scott, everything that Scott does architecturally starts with some kind of embedded trauma. And so for us, and I mean that as a compliment. I think it's an extremely interesting project that Scott has taken on, and I think I'm entirely complimentary in that sense. But it starts with this kind of embedded trauma. For us, this 18th century room, especially the one cell, the original agrarian unit, which was literally a one-room farmhouse, was the kind of trauma that we had introduced into the project that ended up provoking many, many things in the project. In particular, the trauma was produced by walking into this room and realizing that the bottoms of beams were brushing my hair. So the ceiling height in this room was about 6'1". And as you can imagine, trying to place another house around this and to try to somehow exploit that sectional issue was a kind of extraordinary thing to start thinking about. So this was one of the problems for us in trying to approach the house. But before that, these other two preconditions are in fact, I think, fully in play here. And both the notion of the compound figure and also the notion of where technologies are lying and the role of form at the same time. So we began to look at this house, trying to basically meld some of these issues in some form. We began thinking a little bit about the fact that the history of this kind of work, houses and houses in relation to older buildings in particular, has tended to be very polar. It's tended to say either a kind of early 20th century architect probably would have said, let's just tear the thing down and build a nice modern house and be done with it. Or somewhere along comes 1970 or so, and an architect would have said, come hell or high water, let's maintain a kind of loyalty to the old thing, and whatever we build that's new should somehow be sympathetic to that. And there's a third model, which was a kind of caricaturing of modernism in relation to the old, and all of those seemed unsatisfactory to us. So what we began to look at was the introduction of what's referred to on the right in this slide as a box, a really simple kind of conceit to the position of a certain spatial unit between the old house and the new house, which would in a sense supersede the relevance of either old or new. So we took this box and essentially allowed it to unwind into the wings of both the old house and the new house, and allowed it to in a sense, constitute the organizing logic, the formal logic, the material logic, the technical logic for the overall house. This is a kind of a time lapse of that unwinding. That's the object. And ultimately, this is an early drawing. It's not exactly how it ends up, but it's fairly close. Ultimately, this object is a teak box that unwinds out into the existing house. There are a few interesting parameters about it. One of the other peculiar attributes of this house is that it was hard up against a road, but it also was landlocked on 3 sides by a public park. And the public road is on this side, right up against the house on this side, and the park is out this way. So you can imagine out this way, the owners own 3 acres, but there is about a 15-acre park surrounding them that as of 6 p.m. becomes theirs. And so this tunnel basically goes from being very close to a road out onto an expansive space to the south, which is essentially infinite, especially after 6 p.m. when the gates to the park are closed. Here's that box embedded in a kind of ghost image of the house. You can see the box here, the road on this side. This is the older part of the house. This room right here is the 18th century origin of the house. This is the main entry of the house down in here, but you can see this unwinding to create an entry box or an entry hall, which is by and large transparent in this direction and by and large opaque in this direction, although then opened up through the unfurling, and a series of extensions of that box that produce proscenium-like ceiling surfaces, a staircase in the back connecting to a kid's room here, a tether down the hallway to the bedrooms of the older house. This is all older 18th and 19th century architecture over here. The original house was actually extended out this way as well. Here are the plans. The box that I'm talking about is here. Kitchen here. Secondary entrance here from a car corridor on this side. This is that original 18th century box with the 6'1" ceiling. A dining room, a living room, also 19th century. A terrace here, sunroom here. This is a new space. Second floor, master bedroom, kids' room, new space, existing spaces back here. Here you can see that box unwinding back into the hallway to connect the new wing of the house to the old wing of the house at this point. A couple of skylights indicated here. You're looking at the pale parts of this are in the ceiling, and the darker parts are in the floor. An early design study. That box again right here. All of this is the new elevation of the house. Materially, ultimately, you'll see maybe more explicitly here, materially the house is basalt at the bottom and wood at the top to let the house kind of slide around on its own base, pushing this back down almost into a kind of landscape. And here you can see the inside of this box where there are a couple of, this is the alignment of the original box, the stair that springs from it, winding back into a kid's room, casework inside there's a study at this point in the plan, a powder room down here. You're on the second floor looking down. A transverse view across that box where you're looking obviously into the kitchen here, up into the study here. Very interesting sets of surface relationships emerged during the course of the project's design. Things like that corner, I'll show you a detail in a moment. This ramp is, in fact, one of the key things in trying to negotiate the relationship between that very low room and lower spaces in the existing house and the newer house. One of the benefits, I think, of that existing space being so low was that we felt obliged, to some extent, to keep the new house low. And in fact, came to realize that it takes very little to change the generosity of space. In this case, this ceiling is 8'4", so 4 inches more than, say, a tract house. And in fact, it entirely changes the nature of the space simply by adding those 4 inches in, and keeps us within a kind of tolerance in relation to the rest of the house's section. As we began to work on these surfaces and start to read them from different vantage points in the design process, and then finally in construction, some other things began to appear to us that remain very interesting, and actually are things that I certainly intend to explore further. I was very struck by, in this case, looking down the entry, looking back out toward the main entry door, the particular kinds of issues that, say, somebody like Albers was working with many, many years ago, 4 decades ago, in which 2D representations began to move off the page and sort of oscillate into 3D. What I was struck by as we started to work with these surfaces was the opposite. In fact, that there was a possibility that 3D or volumetric deployments of surfaces would begin to push back into 2D. Again, a kind of deliberate attempt to negotiate, let's say, a less fully 3D and a more 2.5D logic of space, in which the windings of program, the windings of form are more embedded in one another. So this is a very simple trick. It's a right side up, upside down room in which you can start to sort of play that game in a sense, or that corner detail that I referred to earlier. Two places where there's a juncture in the old and the new. This is the old wing, obviously the new wing. The new box over a sunroom. This is the 18th century room down here, 19th going this way. And then a more abrupt relationship between old and new. In fact, this wall and this wall are the same wall. So this window and that window are the same window. These two are pushed up against one another, and you get a sense of what that original room looked like. I'm sort of crouching, I think, taking this photograph. I'm about almost at bench height here. You can see where the horizon line is in that photograph. But a completely enclosed room directly abutted against a completely open room. Many things came up having to do with this flattening that I was talking about, in particular in the section, and the way in which we would have to negotiate not only the application of materials on surfaces, but the physical construction of the building to produce this kind of flat state. And in particular, structure became a real problem because in order to keep things flat, we could never do this with beams. We could never have one beam in order to achieve cantilevers, which is the sort of easy way to do this, have one beam sitting on top of another. So we were constantly dealing with coplanar structure, which, as you can imagine, creates boxes in which mechanical systems have a very difficult time escaping. So we had to invent a kind of moment frame for any punctures going through. And sort of, luckily, we had a very good contractor who also happened to be a structural engineer, and was willing to do things like this, where essentially the entire web of the beam is taken out and replaced with a moment frame in which at a moment where the duct and the web are more or less the same size altogether. So we had to invent details like that. We also had to kind of unload certain parts of the labor process because of the integration of ducts in the framing. So normally this is a carpenter, a rough carpenter who's doing this. The steel is a steel guy. But if you look here at these hangers and the fact that the hangers and the openings for these ducts had to be coordinated, in fact, we had to take the work of the hangers, normally in the rough carpentry trade, give it to the steel guy, and basically shift some of the locations of labor into different regions in order to achieve this. It's a very interesting process, actually, very game contractor along the way. Pardon me?
Not union, no unions?
No union. No union.
I've done that in New York because unions can't cross trades, right? Like the woodwork.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No, there was no union here. And the guy, I mean, there was no, we could talk a lot about this, but there was no, for example, we would go out, we'd look at this in the field, or we'd look at it in the drawings. I had to develop a set of drawings, for example, that would communicate the problem so that we could get the framer, the steel guy, the contractor, the mechanical guy, all to agree to do this, including the consultants, not only the fabricators, but the consultants. So we basically invented a set of drawings that would show all of these things simultaneously, and everybody had to sign off on them and say, yeah, we're good to go. It's quite complicated. Things like trying to get duct runs in between these bays of steel, and also going through either simple framing like TJI, wood truss joist kinds of systems, or steel. They were often, for example, the framing was propped up, ducts slipped through, all of it laid down at one time, things like that, that all had to be coordinated like that. It was a very interesting process. It definitely takes a non-union and a kind of flexible dynamic among participants. We wanted to deal with this notion of flatness in many, many different ways, not only structurally and mechanically, et cetera, or sectionally, but also at the level of a detail. This is, I would say, the world's dumbest detail. It's a piece of sheetrock meeting a piece of wood, but we didn't want that piece of wood visible. We wanted the sheetrock to become a kind of paint surface, and we wanted the wood to become equally a paint surface. So given our lack of interest in the obsessive kind of qualities of construction that a miter might have produced here, and also the susceptibilities of that to failure in the long run, we developed this where we modified a piece of trim basically to allow paint to come out to meet wood, and in a sense flatten even the 3/8 of wood and the 5/8 of sheetrock into similarly flattened states. That's a view of the kitchen, this kind of proscenium surface that I was talking about that wraps out of the figure. This is the powder room. The main box is right behind this wall over here, so it's wrapped around at this point over here. It's also wrapped back into the study. You can't see it here, but back into casework in the study. Looking across that space now, this is the entry hall down below. So that box is actually moving through this way. This is the line of the longitudinal axis of the box, the original box. This is looking back from the street side back to the main entry door on the opposite side. That's that sloped ramp. So the low room is right below this room, down below. That's the original, the room down below this room is the original 18th century room. A view along the perpendicular axis of the box from the master bedroom, where you see the ceiling of that box remains more or less intact throughout the north-south run of the house along its length. And then a kind of double perspective that we were trying to play with at various points, where a window on the floor of the study leading back into the casework and the feeding through of the ceiling here, moving off in 90 degrees relative to one another, sort of a kind of flounder's double perspective, looking out at two sides at the same time. And that is where I'm going to end. Thank you.